You might know that I'm the editor of a small news website called The Daily Bell. And one of the writers for The Daily Bell is named Ben Barty. Ben wrote an article the other day which included information about the correlation between people who have taken 2 COVID vaccines and a booster and who believe that a no-fly zone should be enforced by NATO in Ukraine. If you look at the chart that I'll show you right now, you can see that the more vaccine doses you have received, the more likely you are to support NATO establishing a no-fly zone in Ukraine. Among people who received 3 doses or more, 59% support a no-fly zone. If people received 2 doses, 34% support that no-fly zone. And people who have not been vaccinated, only 18% support that no-fly zone. The question is, what is the link between this? And that's what Ben and I discuss. Unfortunately, I didn't know how to properly use the Zoom record feature, so my end of the video was not recorded. The whole conversation is there, but instead of seeing the video of me talking, you're just gonna see a picture of me. I'll get that fixed for next time, but for now, I hope you enjoy this discussion.
There doesn't really seem to be much of a natural correlation between, what someone thinks about the COVID regime compared to what they would think about the Ukraine-Russia war. Unless there's some mechanism that you can identify that creates these attitudes artificially.
Right. What exactly do COVID vaccination and support for a NATO no-fly zone in Ukraine have in common? And on the surface, you'd think that they have absolutely nothing in common. So you would expect no correlation. So how should Canada respond to Ukraine invasion, vaccinated versus unvaccinated? And I find it interesting that they even decided to ask this question. They even thought that was relevant. So in the blue, we got respondents who said they received 3 or more shots. So this isn't just people who got vaccinated. They got the double vaccination and a booster versus respondents who said they were unvaccinated. So it's the most dedicated vaccine proponents and the people who just did not get vaccinated for whatever reason. So respondents who said they had received 3 or more shots, imposing tougher economic sanctions on Russia, 86% said that they were in favor of that. Seizing the assets of Russian oligarchs, 85%. Cutting off oil shipments to Russia, 81%. And then when you look at the column with respondents who were not vaccinated, it is much lower. Imposing tougher sanctions on Russia, 13%. Cutting off oil shipments from Russia, 21%. And then going down to that, dispatching military forces to Ukraine, 11% versus 30%. So what's going on? What did the vaccines cause people to support Ukraine? What would that mechanism be? You know what I mean? Because these aren't typical left-right positions. And I think that's part of the issue here, is that when we're framing this a lot of times in our articles on the Daily Bell and my videos, we have to say the left, the people that got vaccinated, where the left was really excited to get vaccinated. The people who are all super excited about supporting Ukraine, it's the left. Is this really a left versus right thing though? Because typically I would have thought of left versus right being high taxes versus low taxes, or social issues like abortion, education, all that,
or war versus no war. Traditionally the left was the anti-war.
It seems like these are new dividing lines between basically people who are authoritarians, and the vaccine uptake is just an indicator basically of how pro-authoritarian people were when it came to COVID lockdowns and everything like that. Obviously, there's not going to be an exact 100% correlation between those people, but for the most part, if you got 2 vaccines and a booster, you're probably essentially believing the fear campaign from the media. The same types of people that believe everything the media said about how scary and severe COVID was are also the same type of people who will just believe absolutely anything the media says about Ukraine.
Yeah. I've thought a lot about this left right thing, and how it's sort of evolved recently. I've touched on it in other articles, but like you said, I do, like, for shorthand, I reference the left as sort of the corporate. I use the term corporate state a lot, like the corporate state monolith. Um, like that is, the Democratic Party is very, very much intertwined with the corporate media, what you would call the deep state, the intelligence community, um, the corporations that essentially run the government. Like they're all sort of one entity. And I mean, and also the establishment Republican faction also. But yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon, referring to the left as the establishment now. In a previous era, that the defining feature of the left was, sort of anti-establishment. So like, yeah, I mean, when I use the left now in shorthand, I'm essentially referring to like the conglomeration of interests.
Yeah, exactly. I see it as basically there being people who are authoritarians who want more power for the government, but also, like you said, corporations, and not corporations in the sense of like somebody who started a business and was successful in business. Corporations, as in that revolving door between the government and these large industries that get special tax breaks, that get handouts from the government. Obviously, the banking industry, the pharmaceutical industry. These are not completely independent businesses that somehow like bootstrap their way to the top. There's a revolving door. There's captured government agencies, and this is the same thing for the media. So when you look at these, this ruling class, like you said, there's this whole group of people, and it doesn't really matter the party line. I mean, I'm going to get back to that because there is definitely differences between the parties. But like you said, the establishment Republicans, it's no different than the establishment Democrats. And then you have on both sides, you have like Tulsi Gabbard, who is on the left, but is now basically being thrust out of the left because she dares to not, follow every single line that they say.
That was another point I wanted to mention. I feel sometimes I catch myself feeling a little bit, not really, a little bit guilty about using the term left so gratuitously and like reflexively, because there are legitimate, I mean, that's a subjective judgment, but in my view, legitimate leftists out there like Glenn Greenwald. I'm a big fan of Jimmy Dore. I like a lot of stuff he does. Tulsi Gabbard, like you said. And I would definitely, I mean, they're clearly outside of this cabal that we were talking about earlier. Just the other day, Chris Hedges, who's like, he kind of made his bones as like a hardline anti-war guy. He got his entire catalog on RT America wiped out, in the great purge of, the current day.
Yeah, Russia Times, right?
Yeah. And I mean, and he's as far from establishment as you could get. I mean, he obviously doesn't have like a lot in. There's a lot that he doesn't have in common with the Steve Bannon types of the world. But what they do have in common is that they're on the outside, which is this. It speaks to, I think, this like realignment that we've been talking about.
I mean, there's so much to unpack here because the terms keep shifting. It's like liberal, classical liberal. I mean, completely different things these days. You can say progressives for the left, and so does it make sense to keep saying left versus right? Is there a better way to put this, or is that kind of a meaningless exercise? Do people understand what we're talking about, or
yeah, that's the problem is like, I mean, if you engineer new terms to use, I mean, you're going to have to spend a lot of time explaining them, like left and right is just a real quick, easy. I mean, it's also lazy, I mean, it's lazy, it's convenient. When you're writing an article, you don't have to like, when you just throw out left and right, like, I mean, you're kind of assuming the reader knows what you're talking about, but you're saving yourself the work of trying to parse out like, what these terms mean. But yeah, I
Yeah.
do think they're becoming increasingly irrelevant.
Yeah, and I think the other problem sometimes is that what you get is these straw man arguments where if you say left versus right, then the reader or listener or whoever thinks that they can put any position they assume to be right wing on you and say, well, what about this? It's sort of like a what aboutism thing where, well, wouldn't you say this position, which I assume you agree with because you just said this left versus right thing. The article that you wrote yesterday, the whole Oceania thing. This is going back to George Orwell's. I know we've always been at war with Eurasia, even though Winston remembers very well a couple of years ago they were not at war with Eurasia; they were at war with East Asia. And so, like, the media just can flip a switch and do this overnight. We saw it. This is with what happened with COVID. This is what's happening with Ukraine. And that's not to say that the invasion of Ukraine is justified or anything. Like, personally, I don't think that it makes sense for Putin to invade Ukraine. I don't think that's like a good thing.
Can I say something?
Absolutely, yeah.
My wife is gonna watch this probably. So she's Ukrainian. I've lived in Ukraine. I love Ukraine. I think Ukraine should be independent from Russia. It has its own history. I know there's a lot of right wingers who conflate the two as if they're one single entity, and you frame it like Russia's just reclaiming its rightful territory. I don't buy into that. I think Russia and Ukraine are separate. They should be separate. All the Ukrainians I know, granted, I lived on the west of Ukraine, which is quite different than the east of Ukraine, but all the Ukrainians I ever met they're genuinely Ukrainian patriots. They're not like secretly wishing for like the Russians to come liberate them or whatever, however the narrative goes. And what I wanted to say was, like, these people who I referenced in my article, like Randy Weingarten, this creature who's the teachers union head, and all of these people who virtue signal about supporting Ukraine, who don't know anything about Ukraine, couldn't care less about Ukraine. It's just the convenient like issue of the day for them. I was thinking about it, and I reminded myself of this quote from The Great Gatsby, which is like one of my favorite books. So he's talking about Tom and Daisy, who are like the rich oligarchs of the novel. And at the end, I won't go through the whole plot, but at the end, after they've sort of destroyed everything, he wrote this. They were careless people, Tom and Daisy. They smashed up things and creatures and then retreated back into their money or their vast carelessness or whatever it was that kept them together, and let other people clean up the mess that they made. So that's what I think about these people who don't have any skin in the game. And, whatever happens in Ukraine, it's not going to be their loss.
And do you think it's a small special interest? As in, do you think there's people who have one particular thing to gain from this or that? Or do you think that there's like a larger narrative, you know what I mean? Like a larger cabal or whatever you want to call it, that's like dictating these things from the top? Because I think that's another important point where we can talk about a lot of things in isolation. But then when you look at those stats where it's like, well, it's the same exact people that believe the whole COVID narrative and who believe the whole Ukraine narrative. But when you look at this lockstep switch in what people believe or what people are focused on from day to day, kind of seems to suggest that there's like a larger play here, that there's somebody or some entity at the top that's kind of dictating some of this stuff.
I mean, that's just objectively true. I mean, look at the news coverage. It went from nonstop COVID fear mongering to nonstop war cheerleading overnight, really, like almost literally overnight. And you can't explain that. Like, why would every media outlet at the same time adjust its narrative, like do like a complete turn in a new direction? The COVID coverage virtually disappeared all across every platform at the same time, and all of these outlets then started focusing on the Russia-Ukraine war. That doesn't happen organically. There are forces at play that are unseen that direct what the media covers and what it doesn't cover and how it covers certain things.
Yeah, and it's like not a lot of substance either. It's support Ukraine, but it's not really like, let's go back to 2014 and figure out the causes of this. It's not really what has NATO been doing in Europe. And again, not like blaming, not supporting Russia or blaming the US for this entire thing, but wouldn't objective media bring those questions in there? Because that's what journalism used to be all about, is asking questions. So wouldn't they try to get back to the source and say, and here's an overview of what NATO has been doing for the last 20 years, you know? The other one that I mentioned in a previous video from an article that you wrote was this whole Ukraine chemicals, weapons, biolabs thing, which was another one of these cases where first the media completely ignored it. They acted like it was a conspiracy theory. Then they said, well, you know, the US has some labs there, but they're not bioweapons labs. And I was like, well, they are storing bioweapons there, but they're, you know, for peaceful research, which, holy shit, like, what does that mean?
Yeah. It's peaceful research, but we're terrified that the Russians might get their hands on it and use our peaceful research for to commit war crimes.
It's just
it doesn't make any sense. And that's pretty much the exact same process that occurred with the whole coronavirus origin cover up. It's almost, I mean, like, going back to what you were saying earlier, it's the same processes that play out over and over and over and over. And like, I guess that's one of the reasons, like, some people can't really see what's happening, is because like maybe they haven't looked at the media. They don't pay as close of attention as, you know, someone like, I consume media all the time. From all different sources. I consume corporate media just to kind of see what they're saying, you know, so I can identify these sort of like their playbook. They have a playbook that they use for managing every crisis. And maybe, I don't know, maybe that's why some people, it's not so obvious to them, because they can't see the parallels.
With the corporate media, generally half of the article is true or relatively true. There's usually a breaking point in the article where you see them shift from reporting the new thing that is the topic that they want to talk about to promoting the narrative or the propaganda. They'll even report something that casts doubt on vaccines, on how effective vaccines are, but the second half of the article is always,
you get your vaccine. Get your vaccine.
It's really, like you said, I don't want to go too heavy on like blaming the useful idiots or being like, how, you know, these people are like the enemy of whatever. I don't think most people are that like invested in it. I don't think most people pay that close attention. An MSNBC article says pandemic fitness trends have gone extreme, literally. Yeah, white supremacists' latest scheme to valorize violence and hypermasculinity has gone digital. Initially lured with health tips and strategies for positive physical changes, new recruits are later invited to closed chat groups where far-right content is shared. And basically, like, the article is essentially like, Hitler was into fitness, therefore, if you're into fitness, you are a white supremacist. I'm kind of exaggerating, but like only a little bit. That's essentially what the article is doing, is taking a few anecdotes of these fitness chats where somebody shared some like crazy, you know, white supremacist content and being like, well, now fitness chats are a breeding ground for white supremacy, clearly.
It's amazing, isn't it? You know, they constantly go on about right-wing conspiracy theories and QAnon. You know, they love like beating up their QAnon boogeyman, which probably literally consists of like a couple hundred people, you know, I don't know. I've never met anyone. I've never interacted with anyone that
Yeah.
actually is like a QAnon person.
That's sort of what I try to stay away from. Like, I still want to be rational. Some of the stuff to the untrained eye that we're talking about might seem like conspiracy theories to people. We're like talking about there's some organization at the top who's like, you know, running the media and everything. But I want to make it clear that this is not a vast left-wing conspiracy, like as Hillary Clinton, you know, would have said the opposite. But there is a few people who get to control the narrative. It's indisputable. There's a few people at the top. There's revolving doors in pharmaceutical companies into government agencies, in, you know, the CIA, in Operation Mockingbird. These are things that we can confirm that did happen, that are almost certainly still happening. So it's not this conspiracy theory that there's this unknown cabal. It is happening. We see this every single time. And then we identify a few of these key players. Like you mentioned the whole COVID thing in the lab in Wuhan. The people that wrote the letter for the Lancet saying that it was, you know, anti-science and anti-Asian to say that maybe the virus came from the lab in Wuhan were the people that were funding the lab in Wuhan. Peter Daszak, you know,
Yes.
These are a few of the people that get exposed. Is Peter Daszak, this zoologist who bundles loans, you know, or grants from the federal government to hand out to biolabs, is he the guy at the top? No, of course not. You know what I mean? But there's a few, when you have a few key players in key positions, you can do this sort of thing. When you have, you know, the editor at the Lancet, you know, there are emails between Fauci and the head of the organization, Collins, whatever, that were saying, let's take this out, take them out. The Great Barrington Declaration that said, you know.
Well, the whole conspiracy thing, like, I mean, I hate Anthony Fauci, you know, I hope he burns. If there is a hell, I hope he burns in it. But I would never say he's not super intelligent. I mean, he obviously is, to have been able to coordinate a global deception of that scale. So like, the point is, like, these people like Daszak and Fauci and Gates, they don't need anyone, you know, and their whole like cadre of people who are interested in money and power and have the will and the ability to accumulate it. They don't need anybody to like whisper in their ear instructions on how to collude with one another. Like, they know how their bread gets buttered. They know how their racket works. And they execute it. You know, it doesn't have to be like, you know, okay, like, here's the meeting of the global cabal. Like, you know, here the secretary over here is taking minutes. Like, let's do our like bullet points of our game plan. It doesn't have to be as explicit as that, you know? Right.
Much more subtle. And I think anybody that looks at like office culture, if they work in an office, people that remember high school, any organization with other human beings that you've been in, you have seen these people. You have seen these people who work behind the scenes, who start a rumor, who whisper this, who whisper that, who somehow just get their hands on the controls of whatever little power that is around them. So why wouldn't that be happening, you know, at a higher level? I want to get your take on this. So we've written some articles, you've written a few articles criticizing this whole trans thing, right? You know, the media seems obsessed with trans people. This wasn't even a thing a few years ago. And suddenly it's like, everybody's trans, we have to respect transgender people, you know, and it's weird to me. It's weird that this is such like a big push. And I've been trying to figure this out, like why they're so obsessed with this whole trans thing. And now a normal person, I'm just automatically excluding myself from a normal person. The normies might say that they're just trying to be accepting and loving, and like there's kids that are struggling, and like if we don't accept them as a society, that's going to harm them. And so that's like the attitude that you're supposed to believe. And I believe that most people who talk about this sort of stuff do believe that.
Yeah. I think most people who subscribe to this nonsense are like, they genuinely think that they're on the side of empathy and compassion and tolerance,
Exactly.
diversity.
Yep. And so I personally think I'm on the side of empathy because I see what's being done to young, impressionable people, a lot of them who regret these decisions to transition because you can't actually transition sexes. I have empathy for them because I think they're being brought into this larger game that somebody is playing and they're the unwitting victims. So I hadn't thought about this. I saw this thread on Twitter from Josh Dawes. I don't know who this is. But he was talking about this meme that people shared, and this is, the Florida Don't Say Gay bill trying to make sure that teachers can't indoctrinate your kids into this weird gender identity agenda. And basically, this meme, it's not rocket science, guys. They're just evil and they want to diddle your kids. Like, he's saying that basically anybody who supports teachers being able to talk about transgender gay stuff with little kids is basically a pedophile or a child sexual predator. And he's saying it's like, okay, it opens the door to that type of person, but are all these people really like child molesters? No, a lot of them, like we just said, are probably think they're being empathetic. And he kind of opened my eyes to this whole thing through this Twitter thread. The left doesn't want to diddle kids. They want to create little revolutionaries. And to do that, they need to sever the bond between students and the parents. They believe that because they believe that parents are raising these kids to be hateful bigots. And so then he goes into why they start with critical race theory. So it starts with critical race theory to make either the Black kids already pissed off and like little revolutionaries, pissed off about the injustices, and to make the white kids feel terrible about themselves, like they're the cause of this injustice. And so he's connecting critical race theory, this idea that it's a white supremacist culture, everything is steeped in racism, and that Black people can't get ahead because of this racism. So that's basically what critical race theory is teaching. It's not teaching history like they like to say. Anyway, this is connected because it creates this feeling in these white kids that they're bad. They feel shame and guilt. And so then you hand them this gender identity stuff and you give them an out from this shame and this feeling that they're bad people, and they get to join these classes of people who have been oppressed just by saying that they're pansexual or potsexual, or I don't know what the other terms are for these, but basically they're priming them for this. And the longer you keep them from getting the parents into this conversation, the more time you have to create this little revolutionary. And then by the time the parents come in, they're the enemy. What are they trying to do? They're trying to do exactly what the teacher warned these kids about, that they're going to oppress these minorities. They're going to keep this segregated, hateful world. And so these little revolutionaries are supposed to fight back against that. That's his basic point. And I felt like that really connected a lot of dots. And again, this isn't most of these teachers don't know they're doing this. This is a few people at the head of certain organizations. There's federal grants that go into promoting critical race theory. There's policies from Randy Weingarten with the teachers union. There's things at the top who are inserted into the classrooms, and then these teachers go, I'm an empathetic person, I care about these kids, so I'm going to teach this. And they don't realize that they're actually creating these little revolutionaries. I don't know. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I just wrote a few notes while you were talking. I think there's a lot going on in the transgender thing, especially with the children. So first, I agree with a lot of this guy's. I don't know who he is either, but I agree with a lot of this analysis that you summarized. So just to add some more context to it, I think the undermining of parental rights thing is a huge component of it. Hillary Clinton has, she's been she wrote some book in the 90s and said
It takes a village, I think it was.
It takes a village. And ever since then, you know, the left has been obsessed with this concept of like, your child belongs to the community, they belong to the state. I mean, they haven't gone so far as to come out and outright say like your kid is the state's property, but that's been like the direction that they've been heading in. And so if you listen to like leftist, again, to use the shorthand, if you listen to leftist media and the way that they frame these conversations, you'll notice that they talk very derisively about parents who object to the trans stuff in school, you know, drag time story hour, where most people probably know what it is, but if you don't, it's like they invite drag queens who are men dressed up as women, big hairy beasts. They're not like feminine women. They're like obvious men that are dressed up in women's clothing, which is what drag is.
It's like a joke in the gay community. It was like a fun thing they did. It has nothing to do. I don't know why children have to be exposed to this.
Oh, by the way, I was going to also mention this. Every time I start thinking about this, my mind always goes to this analogy of the Hamas terrorist tactic of hiding. I think I wrote about this in one of my articles. The Hamas terrorist tactic of, you know, they have a disadvantage which in the metaphor would be like a rhetorical disadvantage, because, you know, most people, average people, would probably like question introducing gender identities to like 5-year-olds. So like, you know, in the military disadvantage that Hamas has, they hide in hospitals and in schools and fire their rockets at the more powerful enemy, the Israeli or whatever their target is. So I feel like that's all, like they constantly do that, especially with children, you know, they always hide behind the children.
If you attack them, you're attacking the children.
If you attack them, you're attacking the children. Just like if Israel bombs the place that they're firing from, you attack the hospital. You know, it's the same kind of dirty, honorless, you know, there's not really much honor in it. So like another thing I think that the trans agenda serves is divide and conquer. I think if you can make like enough of the population confused enough, which for sure that's what they're doing, you know, like these kids that decide that they're transgender when they're 5 years old, they're in for like a world of pain and confusion growing up, you know, trying to figure out what the fuck they are, like who they are. And I think people that are in like this state of anxiety and uncertainty are much easier to manage than people who have like self-confidence and who have like a strong self-identity, especially one that's bounded to reality in some way, such as I have a penis, therefore I am a male, you know, I'm a male human, and then when I grow up, I'll be a man.
Yeah, starting from the basic building blocks of, you know, kindergarten cop.
Boys have a penis, girls have a vagina.
Well, you taught them the basics. That's important.
Starting from the very obvious things and saying that's no longer reality.
Yeah. And I go back and I read 1984 every couple of years, and it's amazing. Like I don't have any hopes of ever surpassing Orwell, like in terms of like analysis. I mean, he wrote the future like better than I could write the present in a lot of ways. He wrote a lot about how if you can break down people's, you know, when Winston is getting tortured and he asks him what 2 + 2 is, and he forces him to you know, through torture to break down, and yeah, like he literally doesn't even know what 2 + 2 is. He thinks it's 5 because Goldstein, I think is his name.
O'Brien. It's O'Brien.
O'Brien. Yeah. So yeah, like if you can break down people's basic perceptions of what's real and what's not, they're like putty in your hand to do with whatever you want. I mean, and there's also the further ability to demonize anyone who objects as like a right-wing extremist, of course, or transphobe, right-wing extremist, MAGA goon.
That was actually another good point in your article that we just published, is that they tie all these identities into one. it's not just the anti-vaxxer, it's the anti-vaxxer pro-Russia white supremacist guy who likes to work out.
I mean, I did reference the Eurasia to East Asia, which is basically like, the state in the novel could switch the official enemy at will from Eurasia to East Asia, back to Eurasia, whenever it became convenient for them. And I think there's something analogous going on with the corporate state, for lack of a better term, in the current context. Is like you create this like one identity of the enemy, just with different faces to it. So like whenever it's convenient for you, you can just pivot to another facet of the enemy, but you retain all of the mechanisms for generating the hate and for executing the hate and for reaping the political benefits of more social control through the hate. So it's like you have this like plug and play propaganda of like interchangeable parts, and you can just unplug, which was sort of in some of the memes in that article I wrote. Like you just plug one out, plug the other in, and boom, there's no real like, you don't have to reframe the narrative very much. It's very simple and easy, and in that way it becomes like a standardized, industrialized process.
Did you have anything else to say? I think I interrupted you with Drag Queen Story Hour. You said you had a couple points.
The last one that I think is underappreciated is the transhumanist aspect of it. It's kind of a heady concept to get around, but like this idea that humans aren't really like, it's not necessary to tie human identity to like biology or even to like physical reality. Like humans can become like entirely an artificial creation.
So basically the idea that if you were to download your brain into a computer that was sufficiently advanced enough, they believe that you would be the exact same person.
Yeah, I mean, eventually that could be, transhumanism is just like a broader idea of like transcending your physical like meat sack that you walk around in. But I mean, that could like Black Mirror type scenarios like that. Like that is transhumanism for sure. But like, so like my idea is like, if you start with something as basic as erasing your sex and creating a whole new one, maybe not even just like between male and female, but like you can be non-binary too. You can create your own, you can make yourself whatever you want to. I think that's just like one more step towards like slowly
the confusion base. It's more of this confusion between reality.
There's no like definable characteristic of a human, like it's sort of dehumanizing, like if you're just this thing that can be like mechanically altered at will, I feel like it cheapens like the inherent value of a person somehow.
This is all, even if there's not like a specific plan that Bill Gates and Anthony Fauci discussed, this is all part of these ideas that make people easier to control, allow the certain people to scoop up more resources, more money. I don't really think we have to go into super in-depth arguments on why people want power. I think it's obvious that people have always wanted power. So I don't know if I have to really justify why people would want to do that. I think these things though can get a little bit overwhelming, but I really don't think they have the type of power that they want us to believe they have. Because if they did, we couldn't openly mock them with memes. We couldn't, they wouldn't have let cryptocurrency slip through, threatening the entire foundations of their money empire. They wouldn't be allowing the Daily Bell to exist and say the things that we're saying. They want more power to shut those things down. They obviously have a censorship agenda. They obviously have all these things. But I really think that there's still so much opportunity to build new foundations, because the world is going through a transition, and I have a lot of other videos on this, about why this transition is happening, and it's historically based. These things go through cycles, 500-year cycles, 80-year cycles, 50-year business cycles. And during these transitions, the new world order always does shift. And we're likely going through one that is shifting away from these large institutions, nation states, corporations, and into smaller, more decentralized, balkanized institutions. And well, there's a lot to get into there, so I'm not going to like go into all that. But if you look at this Russian invasion of Ukraine, to get back to that, and if Russia really is failing in a sense, it kind of proves this point that we're over the times where you can basically grab wealth with armies, with actual violence. And Russia may have harmed its economy more trying to get the oil and resource regions of Ukraine than it could ever benefit from those regions. So the thesis here is that if you're at a point where decentralizing happens and large armies don't have that power anymore, and violence on a large scale no longer allows these people to gain as much as they used to be able to gain, then perhaps that is a huge opportunity for people in these on the ground, outside your window, look outside, there's a real world out there, and the UN peacekeeping troops aren't there yet. There's real things in your community that have nothing to do with anything that we've talked about today. Maybe the school board, that I think that's one of those issues why the school board becomes a fighting point, is because that's the contact that people have. But you can homeschool your kids. You know what I mean? That there's ways to disconnect from a lot of these things. You definitely don't need to read the media. You can still create businesses on the ground that will help people transition out from relying on these psychopaths at the top and into being more self-sufficient, not in like necessarily the off-grid prepper sense, just like not having to deal with public schools or deal with social security for your retirement and everything like that. So anyway, I just like to, maybe I'm being naive and too optimistic, but I like to end on a positive note because I don't want to leave people thinking like all is lost, all is hopeless, and we just have to like submit, because I think that is also part of that psychological breakdown that they want people to feel, like helplessness.
Yeah, for sure. It's not super complicated in my mind. I think the answer is more localization, more local power, more local control. Breaking away from, should the United States continue to exist as a single country? I don't know. I don't really think so. It seems unmanageable to me.
Yeah.
And should even states, is that too large of a, I kind of think it might be.
Yeah. And that's going to be for people, like I said, on the ground to decide. That's not going to be like, if I could become president of the United States and then dictate how the new lines should be drawn, that would be just as bad as the way they're drawn now. That's kind of the point, is that if it's a grassroots movement, if you can secede at an individual level, that would be the real solution. That's the basic idea of getting back to this bottom-up organization of society, which created all the wonderful things about the prosperous society that we have right now.
Also, that's sort of how nature works, like changes happen like organically down at the molecular level, and then they sort of build on that and become more complicated. There's no like one asshole in charge who like we could get into like religious concepts, but like if you just look at like the mechanics of how nature works, like ecosystems are miraculous, like in terms of like how they're organized, how the organisms like benefit each other mutually, how they all exist. That's not like some artificial like it's not governed by some like bureaucracy. It occurs organically, naturally, which I think is the model that we should work off of, like in terms of human communities.
Exactly. And I think you put it better comparing it to the organic way it happens. You don't have to create an entire 100% self-sufficient property in order to survive, the coming decades. What you need is to have, that community at the basic level. If you have something that you can do and plug into this system that's going to get people less dependent on these harmful large institutions, that's a piece of that natural growth that's going to basically save the world.
That's sort of the opposite of that's like the polar opposite of how someone like Bill Gates thinks, like that's like the antidote to this like narcissistic God complex. Like imagine the hubris to run for president, to think like, yeah, I'm gonna be in charge of 350 million people, and like I'm gonna turn this into a functional system on my own. There has to be something wrong with you, really, like at this deep spiritual level, like something went wrong for you to think that.
I've been teasing this whole parallel economy thing for like a few months. I really am putting something together to come out with this. So for any of those like dedicated people that are still watching my videos till the end, rest assured that I'm not abandoning ship on that. But Ben, I think this was a great conversation. I appreciate you coming on today. I think we'll probably do more of this.
Yeah, man. Appreciate it.